Immortan Joe, the most striking antagonist of the Mad Max universe, appeared in the last two films of the franchise. He is brutal, intelligent, charismatic, and controlled perhaps the only place in the entire Wasteland where one could live somewhat comfortably, the Citadel. Immortan Joe possessed a fearsome appearance and an equally intimidating backstory that clearly explained why he became the leader of the Wasteland. Joe was also essentially an object of worship for the Citadel's inhabitants, which was another testament to his influence. Where did Immortan Joe come from? How did he seize power in the Wasteland? What did he want? And why did he keep an entire harem of wives? Let's explore all of this in this video. In his previous life, Immortan Joe was known as John Moore, a colonel in the Australian Army. He lived in turbulent times, marked by chaos. According to the lore of the Mad Max universe, a global oil crisis struck Earth in the 1980s. This crisis led to the collapse of many nations, and from their ruins, various factions and organizations emerged. It was also during this time that numerous bands of raiders and marauders gained power. In such conditions, the weak and defenseless quickly perished, while only the ruthless, strong, and merciless survived. John Moore was among the latter. He gathered a gang of men as tough as himself and began fighting for survival. Initially, Colonel Moore, with his military discipline, sought to establish some semblance of order. However, he eventually came to terms with the fact that it was impossible, and he became indistinguishable from the many other villains who seized power during the chaos. John Moore's gang turned to looting, killing the weak and children, capturing women, and allowing strong men to join their ranks. Their numbers grew, and soon they became a significant force in the vast expanses of Australia. Sometime later, the colonel gathered his men and led them into the Wasteland, a sparsely populated territory that had once been a remote backwater, and later, following a nuclear apocalypse, became little more than a barren desert. In the early days, Joe typically wore his iconic respirator and had long black or dark brown hair, slicked back and tied with a bandana across his forehead. Joe was resourceful, ruthless, and determined. However, in his quest for a better future, he lost himself, abandoned morality, and became a tyrant, justifying horrific actions in the name of survival and progress. In the Wasteland, Moore and his gang witnessed a conflict between former members of the Main Force Patrol and another group of survivors. John Moore decided to intervene in the conflict and saved a man being pursued. This man revealed to Moore the location of an aquifer, a source of fresh water. The colonel gathered his gang and moved toward this place, known as the Citadel. It was located in a hard-to-reach area atop a cliff and was already occupied by armed and well-organized locals. John Moore initially attempted to negotiate with them, offering a trade: several captive women in exchange for clean drinking water. However, the Citadel's inhabitants rudely refused and attacked Moore's gang. Forced to retreat, Moore and his men went in search of other resources. While traversing in Wasteland, Moore discovered two abandoned settlements. One was a former oil refinery, and the other a lead mine. John saw the potential of these settlements, but without drinking water, all the resources were useless. Thus, he was compelled to return to the Citadel. The Citadel was impregnable, but John Moore's military past was not in vain. He turned to the experience of ancient generals to find a way to conquer this fortress. Inspired by the story of the ancient Indian general, Tanaji Malasade, he decided to act similarly. Joe found a large lizard in the desert. A strong rope was tied to it, and the lizard was sent up the sheer cliff. To motivate it to climb, one of Joe's men sacrificed his finger, which was positioned in front of the lizard's head. Eventually, the animal reached the top, and somehow the rope was secured. Meanwhile, the main part of John Moore's gang attacked the walls of the Citadel to distract its defenders. Meanwhile, the colonel and a few close warriors climbed the rope and attacked the defenders from behind, causing confusion in their ranks. However, the inhabitants of the Citadel were tough and stood their ground. They retreated to the second tower and destroyed the bridge behind them, cutting off the pursuers' path. The remaining members of Morse's gang could only watch the battle that erupted above. Initially, it seemed that the colonel would prevail, but by the end of the day, a fire broke out in the tower, and the battle subsided. Later, the defenders began to hang the bodies of the attackers in a visible place. Those below decided that their leader had died and the plan had failed. The next day, with no news, the raiders were about to leave back to the Wasteland, but then sounds of fighting were heard again, and John Moore appeared from the tower, having defeated all enemies. This victory astonished his people, and they immediately dubbed him Immortan Joe, because if he were a mere mortal, such a feat would have been impossible. Immortan Joe saw in his feat the opportunity to elevate his status to a divine figure and become, in the eyes of his followers, a man who cheated death itself in return. He became the ruler of the Citadel and created a religion around himself, which was a mixture of Scandinavian mythology, ancient Greco-Roman myths, and capitalist elements of the old world, revolving around vehicles and all things mechanical. This led to the emergence of a truly bizarre mix of death cults, where the ultimate dream was the eternal ride on the roads of Valhalla, or a burger feast with the greatest of all time. Water was renamed Aqua-Cola, and Immortan's guards were called Praetorians. The goal of the cult was simple: to elevate Joe to divine status and give everyone hope for an afterlife, which they could all reach if they followed his rules. This cult worked best on people in despair, and there were many of those in the Wasteland. In a world where people lived short and impoverished lives due to catastrophes and radiation, Immortan Joe chose vehicles and mechanisms as symbols of the afterlife. While human bodies could not be rid of diseases, a rusty old car could be fixed and brought back to life. Thus, Joe's followers were obsessed with all things shiny and chrome. However, this cult only captured the minds of the young and weak. Joe's ally, known as the People Eater, whom Immortan placed in charge of Gastown, and Bullet Farmer from the lead mine were aware that all this was merely a tool for control. Once in the Wasteland, another charismatic leader emerged at the head of the biker horde, Dementus. He was smart, brave, and cunning. Much like a young Joe, he challenged Immortan and nearly defeated him, but was killed by his own protege, Furiosa. Thus, Joe reaffirmed his status as the overlord of the Wasteland. The legend of Immortan Joe captivated many hearts, and they traveled to the Citadel from all corners of the Wasteland in search of a better life. They were known as the Wretched, and they were only occasionally allowed to drink water from Immortan Joe's reserves. In exchange, they gave up their children, whom Joe used to consolidate his power. Young boys became fanatical followers of the Immortan Joe cult, and women were used to produce new residents for the Citadel. However, Immortan Joe always feared the future. What would happen to his legacy after his death? He was well aware of the Wasteland's toxicity and dangers, and became obsessed with continuing his lineage by creating a harem of healthy women destined to bear his heir. He found the healthiest and most radiation-free women, named them the Five Wives, and forcibly confined them in the Citadel. They lived in complete abundance and safety, but were compelled to regularly attempt to give Joe a healthy heir. Furiosa was tasked with guarding Joe's wives, which ultimately led to his downfall. Most of these efforts proved largely futile. He had 3 sons, each with physical and mental deficiencies. Ultimately, the reality of the Wasteland caught up with Joe himself. He aged and weakened. His hair grayed, his body became flabby, and covered with large boils and wounds. He also had severe breathing problems, but his status as a ruler allowed him to breathe clean air through a respirator mask, decorated with horse teeth resembling a skeleton's jaw, connected to a large breathing apparatus he wore on his back. Joe covered himself from head to toe with talcum powder to ease the pain. This gave him a mysterious pallor, which his soldiers imitated. Joe wore bulletproof armor made of plexiglass, adorned with several medals for valor and designed to give him a muscular appearance. His meticulously crafted costume was designed to help his weakening body and to hide signs of aging and imminent death from the curious eyes of foes and allies alike. Of course, despite the mystical aura he had created around himself, Joe was just a human, and therefore mortal. After Furiosa betrayed him and fled with the 5 wives, Joe began a chase across the wasteland to reclaim his most valuable possession. Eventually, a severely wounded Furiosa managed to climb aboard Immortan Joe's vehicle during the chase and killed him with a harpoon. After Joe's death, it became clear to everyone that his cult was a sham, and the crowd of Citadel dwellers turned away from their former leader. Furiosa took his place and began to rule the Citadel along with the 5 wives. Thus ended his story. That's all for now. If you like this video, don't forget to rate it, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell. Your activity is the best reward for me. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye.